We can probably all think of somebody whose rise spiritually was way beyond our expectations. Somebody who we just saw in the meeting or in the Truth Somewhere, who just went from strength to strength. Perhaps they helped other people, they might have even helped us. But we may have also seen someone like that, unfortunately, who fell. And of course that kind of thing can be deeply sad, especially on a smaller scale when we perhaps see it happening to ourselves, as sometimes we falter. So Solomon is a fascinating example and a particularly strong example of that phenomenon. He's a man, the magnitude of whose spiritual ascension, whose love for God, whose dedication were matched only by that of his decline. And that is the man, that is a fascinating man who we are going to consider in the next few days, God willing. Early on, Solomon faced extraordinary challenges. There were big expectations of him. He had to take on the kingship. That wasn't easy. But he also had to do something that even his father had not had to do, which was he was going to have to build this enormous, intricate temple of God, which, as we saw in our reading just then, it was his father's idea, but he was not allowed to do it because he had shed too much blood. And all the while, with those challenges ahead of him, on paper, he was too young. He was too inexperienced to do either of those things, to pull them off effectively. And he had these formidable enemies breathing down his neck very early on, who actually felt that he shouldn't be the king and that his brother Adonijah should be the one. So to deal with all that, Solomon would need to learn on a very practical level the power of God's wisdom and apply it to deal with all those things. He'd need to become a man of prayer. He'd need to become a master at teamwork. And I hope we're going to see that this afternoon. He was very clever around leveraging the skills of other people. He was going to need to learn to be a very generous man, and he, perhaps above all that, was going to need to become a very dedicated and hard-working individual. And he stands in the record as a staggering example of those things. He was a very dedicated man in those early stages of his life. And yet, we know the story, don't we? In time, he would find himself having to learn the hardest lesson of all. And that would be the sheer danger of losing focus on the truth, as he slowly but surely lost everything. And all the while looking like he was gaining everything. He was a very successful man on one level. So on one hand, you've got the story of Solomon's. It's a tricky story. It's difficult because on one hand, you've got this deeply inspirational man, and he should inspire us, brothers and sisters, and certainly I hope we see that today. He was incredible. He was absolutely incredible. But just a little, this story should scare us as well, because if he can fall, anybody can fall. And so we'll look to learn not just from his amazing strengths and the victories and all those great things, but also just a little from his equally, unfortunately, amazing mistakes that he made. So anyhow, first up this afternoon, what we're going to do is look, as you would expect, at the early years of Solomon in our first study, how David actually played this key role in his life as he groomed him for the kingship and for the temple project, as I call it. And we'll see that, unfortunately, he would have to, very early on, probably too early, he would have to draw on every ounce of that preparation as he was going to confront the rebellion that would come from Adonijah, Joab and Abiathar, particularly as they took him on and tried to wrestle the kingship from him. I thought first, before we look at that rebellion, which does feature pretty heavily in this talk, we'll just start with a little bit of background. We've got a story, haven't we? And our stories tend to start with our families. And in Solomon's case, the central features or the central individuals in his family were, of course, David and Bathsheba, his mother and father. So, you see them represented there on the screen. Of course, their relationship had these fairly dreadful origins. We know what happened there. But in due time, after the difficulty of losing their first child, they were blessed with Solomon, and he was, of course, prophesied or appointed to be David's successor. And so there was a time of joy around the birth of this particular young child. But let's face it, Solomon's family had issues, not the least of which was the fact that they were cursed. They were cursed because the father of that family, David, we know what he did with Bathsheba, and you might recall the words of Nathan the prophet, as he said, "The sword shall never depart from thine house." 2 Samuel 12 verse 10. The sword shall never depart from thine house. And it didn't. It didn't. And that curse, of course, was fulfilled in dreadful terms as there was this fourfold loss that David incurred. He lost a baby, of course, we talked about that. Amnon died after his sin with Tamar at the hands of Absalom. Absalom then, of course, dies at the hands of Joab, not a particularly nice individual either. We're going to see him a little tonight. And then Adonijah did pretty much the same as Absalom, incredibly. And we'll be looking at him a little later on. And so perhaps reflecting on some of how those older boys were turning out in the early years, we might imagine, and we don't know for sure, but we might imagine he was feeling perhaps a little unsuccessful. Because the curses aside, there is evidence in the record that he had been a little bit absent from his children, and that much is inferred in 1 Kings 1 verse 6. We're going to, you can turn it up, we will be in 1 Kings 1 a fair bit, but we're going to jump to Proverbs in a second, so it's up to you. I'll just read you 1 Kings 1 verse 6, that his father, speaking of Adonijah, it says, his father had not displeased him at any time in saying, "Why hast thou done so?" And that is kind of the introduction to this whole dreadful story of 1 Kings 1, where we know what Adonijah did. He rebels and all these sorts of things. It was founded or was initiated by a boy who just hadn't really been given enough guidance by his father, is the inference. And perhaps we might sort of extrapolate that and say, well, that probably was a feature as to why Amnon was such a rotten kid, and Adonijah. So there was a few of them, wasn't there, that didn't turn out particularly well. Maybe they all kind of had this issue of David being a little absent. And so perhaps with those factors in mind, along with the sheer magnitude of the challenges that David knew Solomon would face, the temple, the kingship, etc., perhaps David and Bathsheba, reflecting on that, thought, well, no, we are going to invest heavily in the divine education of this boy Solomon. We know what he's got ahead of him. We are going to invest super heavily. And it was an education which I think laid the foundation for what we now call the book of Proverbs. So if you come across to Proverbs chapter 4, I did warn you we'll go to Proverbs. In Proverbs chapter 4, we see, we're not going to spend a lot of time in Proverbs, but I just want to look at this reference because it just gives us a feel for how David quite deliberately instructed his son in these divine things. Proverbs chapter 4 and verse 3. I am going to refer to Proverbs a fair bit throughout the talks, just sort of, but we're not going to turn the Proverbs up necessarily. So if you like taking notes, you want to be pretty quick, because it takes so long to keep going back and forth to Proverbs. But what you do find with this story is that there's so many events where if you read what's going on and you reflect on what you know from the book of Proverbs, you just keep seeing the Proverbs kind of yell out at you as you read along. And we'll do a little bit of that. We'll just reference some of the Proverbs that possibly had their origins in the very events we are considering. But in terms of this reference, Proverbs 4 verse 3, it says this. So this is Solomon, of course, speaking or writing. "I was my father, that is David's son, tender and only beloved in the sight of my mother," which of course was Bathsheba. "He taught me also and said to me, let thine heart retain my words, keep my commandments and live. Get wisdom, get understanding, forget it not, neither decline from the words of my mouth." So we know that much of the book of Proverbs, that's a really good reference to kind of underline it, but we know from other references in the book of Proverbs, it is a record of what Solomon's father taught him about how to live life. And we will see from what happens later in the record of his life that it was very, very effective. It was incredibly effective. Solomon was wise beyond his years at a young age. Now, had David changed his approach from those other boys? Maybe, I think probably yes, but it's hard to say for sure. But what we can say for sure is that Solomon's parents definitely immersed him in the Word of God. That is a definite. And that is why we have the book of Proverbs. It is founded on this effort that David and Bathsheba put into educating Solomon to get him ready for this challenging life that lay ahead of him. And it's not an easy thing to do, is it, brothers and sisters? There's children all around us, and getting God's principles to stick in their minds is not that easy. So we have Sunday school, we have youth group, where's Fraser? We have youth conference, pretty topical. He's not putting his hand up, right? He's here somewhere. But we have a youth conference, right, every now and then. We do the readings on a more simple scale, on a more frequent scale. We do all these things to provide these repetitive reminders of God's principles to ourselves, to young people, to adults alike, as we go about daily life. And it can be quite difficult, and it can be, we're busy, but it can be difficult to do it, but we have to make the effort, because if we put the time in, of course, slowly but surely the principles start to stick, and it's just such an invaluable investment. We all know that, but it's just in those moments where we're tired and we don't want to do whatever, that it gets tested, doesn't it? But David's preparations for Solomon actually went quite a long way beyond that sort of divine education, that foundation that he laid. Because some years later, with Solomon, so now Solomon's a little more grown up, still not king, David got the temple preparations underway. Now, you might recall the scene this is an artist representation of the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite. So you might recall the story. It's actually a really tragic story where David had been punished, and the people of Israel had been punished for this exercise of numbering the people of Israel. And on the back of that, David he was a fantastic leader. He finds a way through this tragic scene to actually flip it around and get the temple preparations underway. He says, look, let's put that behind us. This place here, the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite, we're going to build a temple here. Now, the temple, that wasn't when he came up with the idea, but this is where it starts to firm up. He says, we're going to get on with this temple project. We're going to get on with it, and this is where it will be built. We read about that in 1 Chronicles 22. If you come back there, that was, of course, our reading. Where on the back of that, those difficulties, David kind of stands up and he addresses everybody and gets them, it looks like he's trying to get them excited and inspired around this temple project. 1 Chronicles 22 verse 1, then David said, "This is the house of Yahweh Elohim, and this is the altar of the burnt offering of Israel." So there he says it. This is what we're going to do. This is where we're going to do it. And with that event commencing, there was immense work to do. And we read about that in verse 2. David commanded to gather together. So he gets straight into the planning. He commands to get together the strangers that were in the land of Israel. And he set masons to hew, wrought stones to build the house of God. And David prepared iron in abundance for the nails, for the doors of the gates, and for the joinings, and brass in abundance without weight. Also cedar trees in abundance, for the Zidonians and they of Tyre brought much cedar wood to David. So you might recall that, in fact, Hiram, who was his father's friend, who he'd worked with, he was behind the supply of some of those things, particularly the wood. So we'll see him come up again a little later. He played quite a big role in Solomon's life. So anyhow, David, He organised all these things. He got the labour together, he got some stone, iron, brass, a lot of the key materials he organised for the temple. He handed across the design for the temple, so Solomon didn't kind of have to worry about that, which he in turn was given, of course, by Almighty God, who was the mastermind behind the design of the temple. That's in 1 Chronicles 28. We won't turn it up. So he got the plans. And then just to kind of help him even more, David was, I guess, politically astute enough to know that he would need to ensure that the leadership and the senior people in the kingdom got behind his son. And so in various parts of this chapter he deals with that. But let's just read verse 17. It kind of sums it up. 1 Chronicles 22:17. David also commanded. So he commanded all the princes of Israel to help his son, Solomon, his son. So he makes sure that they get behind the effort as well, which would have been helpful for Solomon. So David did a lot of things. On a personal level, he got involved quite heavily straight away in ensuring the project kind of stood up effectively. And I find that kind of interesting because if you reflect on this, it's almost a little bit strange, given what we said before, that he had actually been rejected from doing this job. The whole point was that Solomon was to lead the temple project, not David. It was Solomon who was going to do it. So what is going on here? What is David doing? And on one level, there's a very simple answer to this, and David actually, he answers the question himself in verse 5 of 1 Chronicles 22. He gives the exact reasons why he was doing this. He says, to Solomon, my son, Solomon, my son, is young and tender, and the house that is to be builded for Yahweh must be exceeding magnifical, of fame and of glory throughout all countries. I will therefore now make preparation for it. So David prepared abundantly before his death. So it was, why did he do it? Well, it was because he knew it was really difficult. This was going to be really, really difficult. Second thing, he knew openly Solomon was underqualified. This was theoretically too difficult for Solomon to pull off, so he wanted to help as much as he reasonably could before he died. And thirdly, he would not compromise on the quality of the project, because that would have made it a whole lot easier. If you sort of drop the spec of the temple, well, it would have got a whole lot easier. But David says, that's not an option, we're not going to do that. And so piecing those three thit's I've got to get involved and I've got to help out. He wanted an exceeding, it's a quaint term, isn't it? It's a bit of an old English term, we don't use it, but it's quite powerful, isn't it? Exceeding magnifical. That was the standard that the temple would be built to, and they would not compromise around that. And all those things are kind of logical, they make sense. So yeah, that makes sense. Now I understand why David was involved. But what I think is a little less logical is just how far David went, given the personal cost to him. You look at chapter 22, verse 14. Look at the language. There's a key phrase here in verse 14. He says, now behold, in my trouble I have prepared for the house of Yahweh 100,000 talents of gold, 1,000 talents of silver, and of brass and iron without weight, for it is in abundance. Timber also and stone have I prepared, and thou mayest add thereto. So he encourages everybody else to get involved as well. But let's reflect on him for a second. That phrase, in my trouble, I think that's one of the key phrases in the chapter. If you've got a King James like I've got, the marginal reference is interesting. I think it's really powerful. In my poverty, okay. He was not the super rich individual that his son was going to become. He wasn't anywhere near as wealthy as Solomon. And this is sort of the widow and the last mite principle. He gave everything within reason to this project. ESV says, with great pains he did this. It hurt. It really hurt David to go through this. He had to forgo a lot of things to make this happen. And aside from what that did for Solomon on a practical level, and obviously it did a lot because he got all these things together for him, it was so helpful. You know what, I think there was more to it than this. I think it did something far more powerful than give him materials and give him a design and give him leadership support, all those things, practical things. Because I think it showed to Solomon how incredibly important this was to his father. And I think that was more powerful than all those things. You know, we talk about leadership sometimes, brothers and sisters. And we talk about role modelling as part of that. Well, this is what that looks like. This is what good leadership looks like. This is what good role modelling looks like. It is something that is seen in action. It is something that is seen in personal sacrifice. It's like David is saying to Solomon, the truth, this temple, our God, they are really important to me. They are really, really important. What a great example this is. This is real leadership. And any of us can do this. But just to take the point to a whole nother level, think about this. David had been rejected from doing this. This was his idea. What a brilliant spirit. You know, what would you do? What would I do in this situation? You come up with this great idea, something here at Wilston, and someone kind of, if you had the wrong frame of mind, kind of steals it off you and runs off with it, and you just sit back and watch them kind of enjoy doing this and, you know, getting all the credit so-called, all that sort of thing. We tend to get pretty annoyed when we don't get our way around things like this, don't we? But David, he just didn't. That was just a foreign way of thinking to him. He did not think like that. So like him, you know, we've got to back up all the talk. We talk a lot, got to back it up with actions, and they've got to be actions that demonstrate to especially to children, especially to people we're looking to lead, that we're focused on the truth. Sometimes, and yeah, sometimes it'll be with great pain, like it was for David. So anyhow, having done all that preparation, David was pretty well positioned. If you go to verse 6, he was pretty well positioned to say what he says here, which is that he asks now Solomon to take up the mantle. Then he called for Solomon his son, and he charged him to build an house for Yahweh, God of Israel. And I think that word then is significant, isn't it? On the back of verses 1 to 5. Only after he had set that initial example, doing all those things, getting all the materials, all that sort of thing together, did David demand the same thing of his son. And it's just what we've been talking about, isn't it? Leading by example. And it was the son who he also made it clear about him at that time would go on to be his successor as king. Verse 10. He says, so everyone knows it, this is actually David quoting God, he shall build an house for my name, and he, speaking of Solomon, shall be my son, and I will be his father. Obviously there's a type of Christ here, isn't there? And I will establish the throne of his kingdom over Israel forever. So Solomon would be king. Very clear. Everybody heard it. But that is where the difficulties began, because not everybody felt that this was appropriate, that Solomon would be king. And whether these people were sort of ambivalent to David's perspective, whether they kind of ignored that, you know, supposedly God was behind this, maybe they convinced themselves that was a rumour. We don't know what on earth went through these people's head. But there were a group of people who felt absolutely that this was not right. Solomon should not be the king. And on the surface, when you look at some of the facts, you say, well, perhaps it makes sense. You see, Amnon was the firstborn. He was gone. He was dead. Absalom, the thirdborn, he was dead. Daniel, the secondborn, he's really absent from the record, so maybe he was dead. We don't know what happened with him, but he was right out of it, so you assume he was not suited for whatever reason. Adonijah was the fourth. He was the next in line, and whatever was going on with Daniel, Solomon was way, way behind Adonijah. There was no question. In the natural course of things, Adonijah was the front runner. So sometime after what we just looked at there in 1 Chronicles 22, things took a turn for the worst, because there was a plot brewing. Solomon's brother Adonijah just like Absalom before him, decided that he would be king. And we read about this in 1 Kings and at chapter 1. I did say we'd go there, so here we go. Adonijah, Joab, Abiathar, senior leaders in the kingdom, reflected on this appointment, or the impending, it hadn't happened yet, the impending appointment of Solomon, and they just thought, this is just wrong. We need to stop this. And obviously Adonijah figured he'd be better at the role. And so in verse 5 we read about that, where it says, Adonijah, the son of Haggith, exalted himself. So there's no doubt the divine record's pretty straight up about the motivation. He was a proud young man, and that was something he had in common with his brother Absalom. He said, I will be king. And he prepared him chariots and horsemen and 50 men to run before him. And then almost in brackets, I think, is verse 6, and his father, we've read this, I read this to you, his father had not displeased him at any time in saying, why hast thou done so? And he also was a very goodly man, and his mother bare him after Absalom. So look at the very deliberate connection the divine record is making to Absalom, right? They were peas in a pod, unfortunately for Adonijah. And so you see there on the screen, it would have looked something like this. Adonijah's riding high as the new king. He's got his entourage with him, with no less than the head of the military, pretty key person to have on board, Joab, plus Abiathar, the priest. It was formidable. Adonijah, he didn't have a lot of good characteristics, but he was good at planning, or someone in that crew was, because they were well prepared. And now with David close to death, and he was fading out as a leader, they figured it was the right time to strike. And we read about this in 1 Kings 1 verse 9. Adonijah slew sheep and oxen and fat cattle by the stone of Zoheleth, which is by Enrogel, and called all his brethren, the king's sons. It wasn't actually all, we'll see that in a second, but all the king's sons, as it were, and all the men of Judah, the king's servants. But Nathan the prophet and Benaiah, and it is Benaiah, by the way. I did a lot of research on this, so I'm going to say Benaiah, having said Benaiah all my life. I figured I better check it before I did a special effort, and it's Benaiah. And the mighty men at Cumberland, I said Benaiah when I did this, so I was wrong. And Solomon, his brother, he called not. So they went to the serpent stone at Zoheleth in Enrogel, which is sort of southwest there of Jerusalem, and it was this big gathering arranged by Adonijah, and it was to celebrate his coronation. He was king, and there was all this excitement around this event. New king. But also, we might imagine there was just a little bit of tension at that party as people kind of looked around and saw who wasn't invited. There was an elephant in the room at this party. Solomon, Benaiah, and Zadok were all conspicuously absent from the invite list. Let's just backtrack to verse 8, we'll see. But Zadok the priest, and Benaiah the son of Jehoiada, and Nathan the prophet, and Shimei and Ray, and the mighty men, so these are the elite warriors which belonged to David, were not with Adonijah, which to me kind of proves that Adonijah, deep down at least, he knew that David didn't really support this. He knew that. He was rubbing against what his father wanted. As much as he might have justified this to himself, deep down, the exclusion of those people tells you that he knew David wasn't on board with this. So it was a nasty plan as Adonijah turns God's people, turns the senior officials, turns Solomon's own family against him in this awful plan that I think above all things shows complete and utter disrespect for his father, because he knew what his father wanted. It was so disrespectful, and again, it's something he had in common with Absalom. They had no respect for their father, and it killed them in the end. It killed them. But Solomon wasn't finished just yet, because amidst all that excitement, all the partying about the new king, Adonijah, The prophet Nathan, who was, of course, a loyalist to David, a true loyalist, well, he heard what was going on. And he didn't go and sort of engage Adonijah at that point. He figured that wasn't going to be very effective. And instead he went and spoke to Bathsheba. And she, in turn, headed off to David's throne room. And you can imagine it would have been quite a scene. She would have been distraught, because David had promised her that her son would be king. And I don't think that's necessarily why she would be distraught. She would be distraught because she knew that her life and Solomon's life were now under threat. This could be the end of them, because being the key threat, of course, to Adonijah, first thing you'd expect him to do is execute them. And that's exactly what Adonijah thought was going to happen. So she's pretty upset. So she tells David what Adonijah had done, and then she appeals to him to intervene. Look at verse 20. Thou, my lord, she says, O king, the eyes of all Israel are upon thee, that thou shouldest tell them who shall sit on the throne of my lord the king after him. Right? Now, he'd already told everybody, but tell them again, she's saying, because they didn't listen. Nathan then chimes in, he gets involved, and he backs up her appeal. Nathan says, My lord, O king, hast thou said, Adonijah shall reign after me, and he shall sit upon my throne? Of course he hadn't. He'd said nothing of the sort. You wonder if Adonijah and co had sort of spread some rumours about that. We don't know. And David sort of sits back, and he takes it all in, and he reads the situation perfectly, and he responds very decisively. Verse 32, look at what he does. David says, he didn't have long to think about this either, but he says, Call me Zadok the priest, and Nathan the prophet, and Benaiah the son of Jehoiada. And they came before the king. The king also said unto them, Take with you the servants of your lord, and cause Solomon my son to ride upon mine own mule, and bring him down to Gihon. So there's a lot of deliberate symbolism and association that David is building here. This is the king. This is what all this is about, the mule and everything. And let Zadok the priest and Nathan the prophet anoint him their king over Israel, and blow ye with the trumpet, and say, God save King Solomon. Then ye shall come up after him, that he may come and sit upon my throne, for he shall be king in my stead. And I have appointed him to be ruler over Israel and over Judah. And so that is exactly what they did. So Solomon is anointed king, and now, of course, we have two kings. Now, as an aside, it's just interesting to note that this coronation in 1 Kings chapter 1, this first coronation, it was a pretty rushed affair. You would imagine that's the case, because they were moving quickly to snuff out the momentum of what Adonijah was doing. It was a tactical thing to anoint him. They weren't intending to do it that day. It's actually followed by a second coronation, which is recorded in 1 Chronicles 28 and 29, which is a lot more of a regal affair because it was planned properly. And I just say that because it's really helpful to know that, because when I was first looking at this, I didn't know that, and I found it really hard to get the chronology to work. The reason it doesn't work is because there's two coronations. Once you know that, it all clicks quite nicely. Anyhow, along with that first coronation came this loud, enormous celebration and noise. So loud, in fact, that it resonated across to the party of Adonijah. And it didn't go down very well. You look at verse 41. And Adonijah and all the guests that were with him heard it as they made an end of eating. So they're just finishing their dinner. And when Joab heard the sound of the trumpet, he said, Wherefore is this noise of the city being in an uproar? So Joab was not very happy. Joab was a control freak. I can imagine him kind of grumbling to himself, Who said they could do this? I didn't authorise it. And we read on in verse 42, that while he yet spake, behold, Jonathan the son of Abiathar, so Abiathar stupidly got his children involved. Well, he comes along, and Adonijah says to him, Come in, for thou art a valiant man, and bringest good tidings. And Jonathan answered and said to Adonijah, Verily, our Lord King David has made Solomon king. And so as much as Joab was a control freak, Adonijah was delusional. He thought all this noise, it must be something good. Maybe they're having a party over there for me. But he didn't think it for very long, because we see in verse 43 he found out what was really going on. And once he and all the people there heard what was happening, how David had essentially called their bluff, which is what he'd done, how much trouble they were in, because they were in big trouble. They all sort of slinked off and disappeared quick smart. Verse 49, we see that happen. And all the guests that were with Adonijah were afraid and rose up and went every man his way. And Adonijah feared because of Solomon and arose and went and caught hold of the horns of the altar. So you see the shallowness of Adonijah's relationships? His friends were fair weather friends. Really weak sort of relationships he had built. And so despite all the clever planning, and it was pretty clever, it was a terrible outcome for Adonijah. He had been outmaneuvered essentially by David. And so he runs to the horns of the altar, he grabs a hold of them, and this was, of course, a public appeal for the mercy of Solomon, because he knew that Solomon could have his head for this reasonably. It's interesting, isn't it, when you reflect on what happened here, and sometimes you reflect on our plans sometimes, there's this inevitability about plans we make, even innocently, accidentally, that are opposed to what God wants. In the long run, they just will not work. They will not work. And this was never going to work. This was not in God's plan. And so Adonijah, the whole thing, this beautifully planned and executed effort just fell to pieces because God was not involved in it. So anyhow, Solomon then, of course, he hears what's happened. He hears that it worked, the rebellion fell to pieces. And now, for the first time really in the record, we are going to see Solomon stand up because he is the king now. David's got to step back. He's got to let go of the reins appropriately. That's what he needed to do. And Solomon is going to have to make some decisions of his own. And it was difficult. This was a difficult situation. You imagine, this is his brother. This is his brother, half-brother, yeah, but it's his brother. And we see what he did. This is just, read this carefully. I'll try and read it carefully to you. Just look at how he reacts. Look at the things he says to deal with this tricky situation. 1 Kings 1 and at verse 51. And it was told Solomon, saying, Behold, Adonijah feareth King Solomon. So that's good news. For lo, he has caught hold of the horns of the altar, saying, Let King Solomon swear unto me this day that he will not slay his servant with the sword. And Solomon said, so now he sort of conveys a message by the person who goes and sort of picks up Adonijah from the altar. He gives him this message. If he will show himself a worthy man, there shall not an hair of him fall to the earth. But if wickedness shall be found in him, he shall die. And that is the ultimatum that was taken to Adonijah. He had a little time to think about that as he then travelled from the altar to King Solomon to meet him. So Solomon sent, verse 53, and they brought him down from the altar, and he came and bowed himself to King Solomon. And Solomon said to him 4 words, Go to thine house. And off he goes. He'd already given him the background around if you play up, you'll die. If you don't, you won't. And so he just brings him face to face, says, Go to thine house. Now, so he doesn't say much, right? But I think if you examine carefully what Solomon did here, it's quite fascinating. This is a brilliant man. This is a man who has had his head in his Bible as a child. He's wise beyond his years. There are 3 things that strike me about what he does here that I find interesting and impressive. First thing, they're all pretty simple. He communicated with his older brother, his older, somewhat intimidating, not very nice brother, Adonijah, face to face. That showed courage and confidence. And aside from that, it was just the right thing to do. We don't have tough conversations on email or a forum or behind the back, which is even worse. We do it to the face or we don't do it. Matthew 18, we know about that. But it's difficult. That's why we don't like doing it. Solomon got that right. Second thing he did was he was able to control himself. Imagine the temptation, the natural urge to exact revenge, to go tit for tat at this point. Solomon knew exactly what Adonijah would have done to him if it was flipped around. He was dead. He knew that. Bathsheba knew that. But he didn't reciprocate. And so he shows not only self-control, but he shows this remarkable bias towards mercy, which is something, of course, he had in common with his father, David. And then finally, notice how sparingly he speaks. 4 words. Now, I think that's kind of a challenging benchmark to match, but he doesn't say much. And this is a characteristic of wise people that he would later write about in the book of Proverbs. Wise people don't say that much. A fool is known, even a fool is counted wise, rather, when he holds his tongue. The more we say in tense moments, often the more we can accidentally do damage. So that's how he operated. He outlines these simple consequences, and then he just left it up to Adonijah. That was that. Finished. And then after these events, things kind of stabilised for a while for Solomon. He was king now, of course. His second, more formal coronation took place. And at that, interestingly, David, again, he makes this point. If you read the record of 1 Chronicles 28 and 29, he makes the point, and I'll read these quotes to you, that this is the king. And all the sons were there. All the kids were there. So Adonijah was there. Just in case anyone's forgotten, he says, 1 Chronicles 28, verse 5, of all my sons, for Yahweh has given me many sons, he has chosen Solomon to sit upon my throne. Chapter 29, verse 1, furthermore, David the king said to the congregation, Solomon, my son, whom alone God has chosen, is yet young and tender. Okay, so he's at pains to just re-emphasise Solomon is king, okay, no more rebellions. But unfortunately, Adonijah and his supporters didn't listen again. Because after this, David passes away, and that perhaps was the catalyst with that, I suppose that power broker out of the picture who was on Solomon's side. They figured that was a good catalyst for one more shot at the kingdom. So with David gone, Adonijah makes this approach. Completely different tactics this time, you'll note. Last time it was out there, it was fast, it was sort of a blitzkrieg approach. Totally different this time. And so what he does is he goes up to Bathsheba, who's now fairly elderly and vulnerable, and he figures he can pull something off by manipulating her. And again, you can imagine this would have been a tense scene as well. Look at the history between these two. Bathsheba probably wasn't a big fan of Adonijah, and was probably pretty scared of him. He was a scary individual. But he comes along and he talks to her. And the record of that is 1 Kings chapter 2 and at verse 13. And this is what he did. He said, Adonijah, the son of Haggith, came to Bathsheba, the mother of Solomon. And she said, comest thou peaceably? Fair question, given who he was and what his history was. And he said, oh, yes, peaceably. He said, moreover, I have somewhat to say to thee. And she said, say on. And he said, thou knowest that the kingdom was mine. So there's that delusional side again. And that all Israel set their faces on me. Everybody wanted me to be king, not Solomon, that I should reign. Howbeit, the kingdom is turned about and is become my brother's. Who won't even use his name. For it was his from Yahweh. Mate, what a crazy thing to say. It's like, oh, rats. If it wasn't for God, I'd be king. Oh, it's a technicality. Now, this visit, it was anything but peaceable. This was a deadly proposition, grounded in deceit, in flattery, and in manipulation. He was appealing to the compassionate side of Bathsheba. Look at verse 15. He said, I've just read 15, but read 16. Now I ask thee, one petition, just one thing. Deny me not. And she said to him, say on. And he said, speak, I pray thee, to Solomon the king, for he will not say to thee, nay, that he will give me Abishag the Shunammite to wife. So he won't go face to face. He hides behind Bathsheba. And far from being peaceful, this whole thing was charged with political symbolism because by what he's trying to do is take the former carer of David, which is Abishag, and use that to create another pretext to show that he was the king. Look, I've got Abishag now. I should be king. And he was going to use this to launch a second rebellion. And whether you think it's because people read this differently, you might think it's because Bathsheba was naive, or on the other hand, you might think she was actually the complete opposite and she was switched on and she knew exactly where this was going to end for Adonijah, and she thought, well, I might as well get it over with. Whichever you think, Bathsheba complies. She does exactly what he says. Verse 18, Bathsheba said, well, I will speak for thee unto the king. So she said, okay. Bathsheba therefore went unto King Solomon to speak unto him for Adonijah, and the king rose up to meet her. So look at the respect again, the respect for his parents. He shows his mother here. He rises up to meet her, bows himself to her, sat down on his throne, and caused a seat to be set for the king's mother. And she sat on his right hand. Then she said, I desire one small petition of thee. So it's almost verbatim what she was asked to say. I pray thee, say me not nay. And the king said unto her, ask on, my mother, for I will not say to thee nay, but he would. And she said, let Abishag the Shunammite be given to Adonijah thy brother to wife. So she walks in and she makes the request. As I said, pretty much verbatim. But as soon as he hears it, Solomon calls it for exactly what it was. It was a play for the crown. And so verse 22, he answers and he says to his mother, and why dost thou ask Abishag the Shunammite for Adonijah? Ask for him the kingdom also, for he is my elder brother, and even for him, and for Abiathar the priest, and for Joab the son of Zeruiah. So he knew exactly what this was about. He knew exactly who was involved. I guess he'd been watching them. He knew everything that was going on here, from a very brief question that was asked by Bathsheba. Solomon was an incredibly perceptive man. And in that sense, I think he types our Lord Jesus Christ, who we know. John 2:25. He knew what was in man. Our Lord could read people like a book. They were like an open book to him. And Solomon had that gift. He could just look at someone. He could tell what was going on. He could watch people and he could figure out the machinations. And so he knew exactly what was going on. We go on to read in verse 23, then King Solomon sware by Yahweh, saying, God do so to me, and more also, if Adonijah has not spoken this word against his own life. Now therefore, as Yahweh liveth, which has established me, and set me on the throne of David, my father, and who has made me an house, as he promised, Adonijah shall be put to death this day. So that ability to read people it works its way through here. And Solomon shows another fantastic leadership quality sometimes, which was his ability to be decisive. When he needed to be decisive, he could be very decisive, just like his father. He would later write in Ecclesiastes chapter 10 and verse 11. I'll read from the ASV. If the serpent bites before it is charmed, then there is no advantage to the charmer. There is a time for mercy, but sometimes if evil prevails, there is a time for decisive action. Procrastination can be deadly in some contexts. We shouldn't tolerate sin indefinitely. And Solomon knew that. And so he did act. And Adonijah would receive a visit. Just imagine it. Think about it. Sort of, he's sitting there and he's at home maybe, or in his office or whatever they had back then. Just imagine the scene. I reckon he would have been sitting there. He set all this up. Bathsheba's gone off. Perfect. She fell for the whole thing. Hook, line and sinker. Perfect. And he is feeling good. Remember, he's delusional, right? This is definitely going to work. And he's waiting for a knock at the door. And he is going to be greeted. He can't wait. He's going to be greeted by the beautiful Abishag. She is his ticket to the throne. Finally, he's going to get what he deserves. And he is going to get what he deserves. And the knock came. The knock did come. Yeah. But it was sort of I won't do it. I don't want to knock the lecture on. But I reckon it would have been a pretty deep, hard thud. You might have thought, oh, it's a bit funny. It's a pretty hard knock for Abishag. He's sort of, oh, okay, she's keen. And at that point, he sort of straightens his hair up and, yep. And he goes and answers the door. But it wasn't Abishag. It was someone considerably less attractive than Abishag and vastly more scary. It was Benaiah. It was Benaiah. And Benaiah was lethal. He was the head of the Cherethites and the Pelethites, and they were the king's elite bodyguards. In today's terms, Benaiah was like the head. He was the top dog in the SAS. He was deadly, deadly. Let's have a look. Look at this quote on the screen. This is what it says about him. He slew 2 lion-like men of Moab. He went down also and slew a lion in the midst of a pit of snow. And he slew an Egyptian, a goodly man, and the Egyptian had a spear in his hand. But he went down to him with a staff and plucked the spear out of the Egyptian's hand and slew him with his own spear. In the equivalent record in Chronicles, it tells us that Egyptian was 5 cubits high. That is 7.5 feet tall. He was lethal. No problems. Rip his spear out of his hand and kill him. Benaiah was fearless and deadly. So having been shown the mercy he didn't deserve, I suppose, which is the definition of mercy, isn't it, from his brother, Adonijah spurned it. His scheming was over because now he dies at the hand of Benaiah. 1 of Kings, chapter 2, verse 25. King Solomon sent by the hand of Benaiah, the son of Jehoiada, and he fell upon him that he died. It reminds me of another proverb. It comes up a lot as you look at his life. There's proverbs scattered all through it because they were based on real life things. Proverbs 26:27. Whoso digs a pit shall fall therein, and he that rolls a stone, it shall return upon him. Proverbs 26:27. And wasn't that true? Adonijah and his entourage just dug this huge pit for Solomon, second time round, and they just all fell into it proper this time. This was it. Abiathar was also waiting for a bit of good news, but of course it never came. He was fired and banished. And then there was Joab. So Joab was a little different. He actually heard what was going on before Benaiah actually made it to him. So he runs, like Adonijah had actually previously in the previous rebellion, he runs to the horns of the altar. 1 Kings 2:28. Then the tidings came to Joab. For Joab had turned after Adonijah, though he turned not after Absalom. And Joab fled unto the tabernacle of Yahweh and caught hold of the horns of the altar. And it was told King Solomon that Joab was fled unto the tabernacle of Yahweh, and behold, he is by the altar. Then Solomon sent Benaiah, the son of Jehoiada, saying, Go, fall upon him. So, as I said, he was very perceptive. Solomon saw this appeal for mercy, using the altar like some kind of a trinket, like Adonijah had before him. He saw it for what it was. This was just hypocritical legalism from a man who had demonstrated zero mercy in his life. In fact, the complete opposite. He was a vile man, Joab. He was so evil. He murdered people. So this time, it was different to the first rebellion. The punishment for the would-be rebels was swift and it was severe. They had made 2 mistakes, I think. First thing was they had horribly underestimated Solomon. Okay, if they knew a fraction of how capable he was at this point, they would not have bothered trying this. But they didn't, because he had wisdom and ability that was way beyond his years, which just highlights again how deeply effective that divine education, that preparation that David and Bathsheba put him through, how effective it was. Secondly, though, I think they had this problem where they just believed it was right. Adonijah should have been king. It was just right. They didn't care what David thought. They had a just cause in their heads. And we need to be careful, don't we? Sometimes we have a just cause. Sometimes we know we're right. We just know it. We know we're right. Because when we get like that, when we get fixated and we close our minds, it can make us look kind of stupid like Adonijah. We can ignore the broader issues. We can ignore the facts. We can struggle to listen to things. Sometimes we don't even see things when we are in that kind of state. So there's a warning in the way the rebels conducted themselves here that we should reflect on. So anyhow, finally, there was one last enemy to go, by the way. Shimei, of course, he had slandered David. He was dealt with. He was let off, and then he was given a condition of staying in Jerusalem. Shimei had no integrity. Shimei, that was his problem. And so he couldn't help himself. He runs off at some point, and that was the end of him. So all the enemies were gone at this point, and Solomon took control. 1 Kings 2, verse 46. The kingdom was established in the hand of Solomon. Take away the dross from the silver, and the smith has material for a vessel. Take away the wicked from the presence of the king, and his throne will be established. Proverbs 25, verses 4 and 5. And that is exactly what Solomon did here. He gave people a chance, they blew it, and he just understood, these people need to go. They need to go. They are deeply evil and unrepentant. And I will not progress with this kingdom. I will not progress with leading these people the way I need to, with these individuals breathing down my neck. And so he acted. And so Solomon got off to a brilliant start, courtesy of that fantastic work his parents did. And we're going to see in the next study how he would build on that fantastic start and do some just incredible things for God. And we'll look at that in our next session, God willing.